Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some Year in Bloom cards using the new Year in Bloom collection from Lisa Horton Crafts. Now, I don't have the entire collection. I have 4 of them. So I have the April Tulips embossing folder, the May Peonies embossing folder. Look at that gorgeous detail. The June Foxglove embossing folder, and then finally the August Dahlia embossing folder. I'm going to be using different inks and different techniques for each one of the cards so that we get a few different results. So I'm going to start with the April Tulips embossing folder. Now I want to ink my embossing folder so that I have ink in the background when I'm embossing it. So the way to do this is to feel your embossing folder and feel the background, and then the details, in this case the tulips, will be recessed. Now there's so much detail and texture in these embossing folders that I've done this for years, and I actually even had a hard time choosing which side was the deboss side and which side was the emboss side. So feel both sides, and what you should feel is the background, and when you ink it, you should be inking the background, not the flowers. So this step gets repeated a couple times till you have a completed inked solid background. I like to tape my cardstock in my embossing folder so that I don't have to worry about it moving and shifting on me. I never have to pay attention to the paper and making sure that it's completely aligned because it's taped in place. Now I just use some Best Ever Craft tape for that. And for the detail for these, for all 4 of them, I'm just using, or actually for the first 4, I'm using some Hammermill cardstock. So just some cardstock that you like ink blending and coloring works perfectly for this. You don't need anything that's super thick, just some nice cardstock that embosses nicely. For inking it, I'm using some painted Eggshell Cloud 9 matte blending ink. This is another ink from Lisa Horton Crafts. It's a hybrid ink, so it has some dye properties as well as pigment properties, and it creates a nice solid background. My cardstock is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, so it's a quarter sheet of Hammermill cardstock. And I keep it that size when I'm doing my embossing and when I'm doing my inking. And once I'm totally done, then I'm going to trim it down. For inking these, or for coloring the detail of these, I'm going to use some of the Lisa Horton Crafts wax pastes. So I'm using Peppermint, which is the green color, pink Peony, which is obviously the pink color, and then rich purple, which is obviously the purple color. So I'm starting off with the green for the leaves. Now, the best advice for these wax pastes is be very light-handed. You can always add more to them, but you can't take it away. So by being light-handed, if you feel that you need a little bit more color or you need it a little bit darker, you can always add a little bit more to it. My favorite way to apply wax paste is with my fingers, and you have to be really light-handed with it. If you're too heavy-handed with it, you're going to get some on the background. To be honest, I will regularly get a little bit on the background. I try not to. I haven't tried it yet. I learned it on one of Lisa Horton's videos. I hear that an adhesive eraser will help to remove that, but I actually haven't tried it yet. A little bit of ink on the background doesn't really bother me, but I do try to keep it to a minimum. Once I have that green, the peppermint, done, then I'm going to work on my flowers. So I'm going to start with the pink peony, and I'm covering the whole surface of the tulips. These wax will melt to the heat of your fingers, making them really nice and easy to spread on your cardstock. Because we don't have a stencil for this, or we're not using a stencil for this, you do have to be very careful. So I'm trying to be very light-handed, just getting it on the raised surface. And once again, I'm light-handed and I put just a light amount on. Can always add a little bit more if I want, but I know that I'm going to go back in with the rich purple so that my tulips are pink and purple. It just gives them a little bit of color variation, a little bit more interest to them. Once I'm done with the pink, I'm going to go in with the rich purple. Now for this particular image, I want my tulips to be pink on the top and purple on the bottom. So the easiest way to do that is to flip my image over and then just start with that purple on the bottom and flick that color towards me a little bit. They blend together really, really nicely. But if you find that you're doing this and you're not getting a really good blend, once this purple is done, you can go back in with that pink, flip your image over again and start from the top and flick your way down to blend the 2 colors together. I didn't have to do that. I got enough of a blend. And by doing it this way, I'm getting the heavier amount of that purple on the bottom of the tulip. And as I'm flicking or moving my finger up, there's less color on my hand. So I'm getting less color that way. Once the image is done, and by the way, I used the Lisa Horton Tacky Mat to hold my cardstock down. It just makes it nice so that you don't have to hold your piece of paper down while you're doing your ink blending. I often use a tacky mat or a sticky mat, and I find they're really, really handy for just holding your cardstock. Now, to be totally honest, it's a little bit harder when the cardstock is embossed. It holds flat paper better than embossed, but obviously you can't do this technique without embossing the images first. For my mats, for all of my cards, my image pieces are 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. My biggest mat is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And the mat that goes right around my image piece is 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. So we have a larger border around the outside edge, and then the mats themselves are fairly tiny or fairly narrow. I wanted to have the color of the mats, but I didn't necessarily want them to be the focal point. I wanted the image to be the focal point. In order to completely and perfectly match my pink mat with my tulips, I'm using some white Hammermill cardstock, and then I'm using that same pink wax to go on the edges. Now, when I'm putting it on the edges of that cardstock, I'm going in a straight motion. I'm not going in a circular motion because that wax is going to build up on the outside of the cardstock. So if you do get a little bit of wax buildup, which even happens if you're going in a straight motion, just rub your fingers gently, we don't want paper cuts, along the outside of your cardstock to remove that before you add your mat to the front of the card. For this one, the second mat is a black piece of cardstock. I know I'm going to be using black with my sentiment, and I thought this would be a good way to tie it in as well as frame that image piece. And this is why I chose some smaller mat sizes for these, because I didn't want to have a really thick black mat around it. I wanted it to be just very subtle, very delicate around the outside edge. For my sentiment, I'm using the A Little Hello Sentiments stamp and die set. This is a collaboration with Spellbinders. I've used it before in many videos, and I just love the fact that this hello has 3 layers to it if you want. I'm only going to be using 2 for my card here, but if I wanted to, I could add a 3rd layer. Again, I'm trying to keep the focus on the tulips themselves and not as much on the sentiment. I wanted my sentiment to be purple, so in order to completely and perfectly blend that, I'm using a scrap piece of white cardstock and using that purple wax on it before I do my die cutting. The shadow around my hello is going to be black, so I used a scrap piece of black cardstock for that. Once they're die cut, I can use a die pick to help remove them from the die, as well as all the little bits that go around them. And then I'm gluing everything together with Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle. I use this glue for probably 95% of my projects. I like a liquid glue because it gives you some wiggle room to move things around. And by having a nice fine tip to it, it gives you the ability to use it for fine or smaller die cuts as well as larger areas. Now, you probably saw me earlier. I have a thin pin. It came with my Barely Art glue, and I use that to unclog my glue. Every once in a while it does clog a little bit, so I use that to help that glue flow a little bit better. And then I'm using that to glue my sentiments on. For this particular die set, I already had some sentiments stamped and die cut from the matching stamp set, and I used them on this particular card. For my next card, I don't have them already done, so you'll see me doing them there. Next cards, both, I'm going to do 2 cards. I didn't plan to, I only planned to do 1, but I'll talk about why I did 2 in a moment. I'm using the May Peonies embossing folder, and for my background I'm using the Anthracite. So this is a black, but it has a little bit of a teal tone to it, and I absolutely love it for dark backgrounds. So when I'm putting my Lisa Horton embossing folders through my Platinum 6 machine, my stacking isn't quite thick enough, so I have a piece of index stock that I have folded in half that I use for my Lisa Horton embossing folders. I just keep that with my embossing plate, this gray one here. And so I have the bottom platform, that piece of index stock folded in half, and then the gray embossing plate. So this is where I decided to do 2 cards with this Peonies die set or embossing folder. I did this with the anthracite and I absolutely loved the way it looked just on its own. So off screen, I did a second one to do the actual technique that I had been planning to do with this background. But I just love the look of that with the white and black. It just was so striking. And when I embossed or when I inked that background, I also got some inking in the recesses or the shadow parts of the petals, which I just loved. It gave up or showed all of that detail. So I'm going to make one card with just that plain background, and then this card is the one that I had planned originally. So for inking the flowers, I'm using 2 interference ink pad colors. I'm using Tropical Paradise for the flowers, and I'm using Summer Garden for the leaves. I'm using some detailed blending brushes to do this. This way I can do as much as possible with my ink blending and not get it on my background. I can use the edge of the brush for really thin, fine things like the stems and the tip of the leaves. And then I can use the flat part or the wider edge of the brush to do the wider edges of the leaves and also the florals. I also grabbed my Sweet Treat interference pad to do the centers of the peonies. So they have a little bit of, or have a yellow tone to them. So the leaves are the Summer Garden. This one shows up green on the white areas, and the areas that have that anthracite ink on it, you're going to see more of the interference color, which is blue. So the centers of the flowers are that Sweet Treat. So this is going to show up more yellow, but any of those areas that have that anthracite ink are going to be a little bit of a peachy, corally, pinky color. And then for my florals, I'm using the Tropical Paradise, and as you can see from the front of the pad, this is going to show up a nice bright pink, but any of the areas that the ink is going to be on that anthracite ink, we're going to see more of that bluey purple tone. So we get a lot of shine from the interference ink. Even the areas that are on the white, you're still going to see that shimmer from the interference ink. And when you tilt it in the light, you're going to see that interference color. But this is just a great way to do 2 colors at once. I do this often when I'm using the interference inks. I either use Black Soot Distress ink or Hickory Smoke Distress ink. I have a whole playlist where I share videos or list videos where I use those interference ink pads in a video, and so there's a bunch of different ways that I like to use that. If you wanted to check that out, the playlist is a great source for some different techniques for using these interference inks. I use them often. I have a thing for interference, opalescent, iridescent things, so these are my cup of tea, definitely. And I absolutely I've never gotten over the magic of them. Every time I use them, I fall in love with them even more. So the flowers or the petals of the flowers are actually really, really easy to do. What I do is I start with my brush, and I'm using a detailed brush just like I did with the leaves. I'm starting at the edges, outside edges of the flower, and kind of flicking my way in so that I can get some clean blending on those flowers. I don't want to accidentally get any on my background. I'm trying as hard as possible not to do this. Now, if you wanted to do this technique and not have to work quite as much to try not get color on your background, a dye ink would be perfect for these flowers, because if a dye ink goes over top of that background color, it's transparent, so you're not going to see it. So if you wanted to try this technique but didn't want to have to go or be as careful as you do have to be with these interference pads, a dye ink would be a good way to go. You wouldn't get the shimmer or the interference effects of it, but it's a great way to color your images without having to worry about the color going on the background. So here are my 2 different flowers or different embossed backgrounds. Once again, I'm going to trim them. And again, I do all of my cards for this video the same size. My embossed piece are going to be, or pieces, are going to be 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. My outside mat are going to be 4 inches by 5 1/4. And the mat in between that is 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. So once again, I am using Hammermill Cardstock for my embossed background, and I'm also using it for the mats. One of the ways that I like to match up these inks, because they're so unique, and rather than trying to find a cardstock that is absolutely perfect, I will often use cardstock and use those interference ink pads to color those mats so that they are the perfect size as well as the perfect shade. So I want to have a black mat on both of these, but because, as I mentioned before, this anthracite has a bit of a teal tone to it, I could use black cardstock and it would be just fine, but the easiest way to match it up absolutely perfectly is to use that ink pad around the edge of my mat. And I don't have to ink it very far in, simply because I'm only having a little tiny mat here. I'm going to do the same thing for the mat that I want that pink color on. Again, using my pad around the outside edges. Now you can see I put some on the inside part of my cardstock here. You could always do this on a separate piece of cardstock, but I'm trying to make my cardstock go a little bit farther. And this time I'm using the Smile Stampin' Die set. I think it's called You Make Me Smile. It'll be in the supply list. So rather than using a separate piece of cardstock and inking that, I'm just inking the center of the cardstock that I'm using. Then I can use those dies to cut out of that center. And when I'm assembling my card, I'm going to have layers on top of it anyways, and then the final layer is going to be my embossed piece. So you're not going to see what's cut underneath it. My cardstock is thick enough that even if you put it to the light, you can't see what's underneath it. So why not make your cardstock go just a tiny little bit further, especially if you're wanting to do some unique colors like this. Again, you could use scrap pieces of cardstock, that's totally fine. Regular white cardstock really isn't that expensive. But I especially like to do this when it comes to specialty cards like cardstocks like metallic or glitter cardstocks. Those tend to be a little bit more expensive. So by doing this, you can extend how far your cardstock will go. It'll make them go just a little bit farther, and no one will ever know that you cut anything out from underneath. I've done this for many, many years, and most people that I've shown that to just can't believe that things are cut out underneath. But again, you'd never know. So I'm going to use that Smile die to cut these. I have 2 mats done with the white cardstock and the anthracite ink. I have one done, and those ones with the anthracite ink are the shadows. Then I have one done with that Tropical Paradise inked cardstock, and I'm also doing one with white. Now what I just showed you there is I don't wait. My cardstock with the ink on it is dry, but it's not like bone dry. It hasn't been sitting for a long time. So I'll often get a little bit of that interference transfer with the pressure of the machine. You want to make sure to clean off your plate before die cutting something else, because it will transfer to cardstock. It won't be really, really heavy and really, really dark, but you will see some color on there. So the easiest way to avoid that is just to wipe off your plates with a damp cloth and then dry them before using them again. Any of those Smile shadows that had a little bit of a light area with that anthracite ink, I just went and I inked that a little bit more so that that can dry while I'm doing this next step. And this next step is using the sentiments that come with this Smile Stampin' Die set, putting it in my Misty stamping tool with some scrap paper, and then stamping it with that anthracite ink. And I do stamp it twice just to make sure that I have a nice clear image to it. I'll let that dry for a few minutes, and then I will line up the coordinating die for it. I will tape that in place with some Best Ever Craft tape, and then I will die cut that. So I'm only going to be using 2 of these sub-sentiments for these cards, so the rest of them I'll put in a little Ziploc bag, and I'll just keep them with this Stampin' Die set. So next time I want to use it, I might already have a sentiment or sub-sentiment already stamped and die cut ready to go. This is the best way to do it, because if I'm already using that Stampin' Die set and I have something ready to go, that's generally, I just do this all the time, so I know that that's where I'm going to have them stored, rather than having these stored separately and have to thumb through a lot of pre-done sentiments. So I pick my sub-sentiment, put my glue on there, and put it onto my card, and then I'm ready to add the smile. That smile is much easier to do after that sub-sentiment is down, because then you can work around where it's going to work on the card. I also use an acrylic block often when I'm gluing down layers. It just keeps everything nice and flat, holds those layers down. It's especially important and helpful when it comes to embossed layers, because there's so much texture on there. By having that acrylic block on there, it holds everything in place, and I don't have to hold it and wait for glue to dry. Now I'm ready to glue my second card together. First doing those mats, then doing the embossed piece, and then I will do the same thing with my sentiments as the first card. Now, sometimes I will put my sentiment onto the shadow before adding it to the card. Sometimes I'll do it afterwards. Neither one is right or wrong. Often it's great to be able to see it ahead of time to make sure that you like the layers together. By having that acrylic block there holding things in place, it makes it really, really easy to put the layers on top of that acrylic block and see exactly how things are going to look. Sometimes you just know it's going to be totally fine, so I will do it ahead of time. There's really no rhyme or reason to it. The odd time, and you'll see this later on in the video, I can't choose between which color I want on the card for the upper layer of the sentiment. So I will do 2 of them, and I will put my shadow on and then just put the upper layer on to see which one I prefer with it. So if this background doesn't have enough shimmer and shine to it, I'm adding just a little bit more. I have some of the new Dazzle gel paste. These are some glitter paste with some gorgeous color to them. I'm going to use the lemon fizz one on the center of the florals. I'm just dabbing it up and down for that piece because not only do I want the shimmer, I also want the texture of it. So by dabbing it, I have that little bit of texture. Then I'm using the bubblegum one on my flowers. You don't really see a lot of the glitter per se because there's so much shimmer from that interference pad, but you get that texture from that glitter as well as a little bit of texture from the streaks that my fingers are leaving on there. So when I'm putting it down, I am going with the curves of the petals of the flowers. Because I have to wait for that to dry anyways, I'm using some Stardust Stickles on the center of my anthracite and white card background. The funny thing is that anthracite and white one is one that I hadn't intended to create when I was thinking about the colors, the inks, what I wanted to do for these backgrounds, but it actually is one of my favorites because of the simplicity of it. And obviously it's a lot simpler to make because I only inked that background and then die cut the rest. So if you wanted something that's simple and easy to create, this is a great one for that. I also added some of those stickles to the upper layer of my Smile Sentiment. After doing that, I will often use a die pick to clean up some areas. Sometimes you get a little bit of the stickles that go over the edge of the cardstock. And sometimes when you're putting them down, it's not quite an even enough layer. So using a die pick helps with that. For my next background, I'm using the June Foxgloves embossing folder and put it in my embossing folder. For this one, I'm not inking the background, so there's no need to tape it in place. I'm just embossing it as normal. Once again, using some Hammermill Cardstock, put it through my Platinum 6 machine, and this is the look to it. I absolutely love that background. I think it would be gorgeous just embossed without adding any ink to it. I recently got the brand new metallic ink pads from Lisa Horton Crafts, so I'm going to use those for coloring in these images, and I'm going to use the same detailed ink blending brushes that I used with the same type of ink blending brushes. I have individual brushes for each color. I label them so I know exactly which color each brush is for, and that way I can be sure that I don't contaminate my pads. Now, I haven't used them for a project yet, but I have swatched them on both white cardstock and black cardstock. And you can see, looking at them, I have them in exactly the same order on each piece of cardstock, that there is a color difference between the black and white background. So I'm going to do this card with the white cardstock background and then ink blending, and then my next one is going to have black cardstock, and then I'm going to do the metallic inks on it. For this one, I'm going to use Mojito, Love Struck, and Ultraviolet, and I'm going to use those detailed ink blending brushes to color the image. Now, once again, just like my last one, I will use the side of the ink blending brushes for fine areas such as the stem of the foxgloves, as well as, you know, tips of leaves, tips of flowers, that sort of thing. So by having detailed ink blending brushes, you can have a little bit more control over where that ink goes. So I'm starting with that Mojito, coloring anything that is a leaf or a stem, anything that should be green. Now, in all honesty, I think this background probably would have been better with some of the matte blending inks so that you can get some areas that are light and dark. When I was doing this ink blending, it was fairly hard to get areas that have some visual dimension to them, as in some lighter areas and dark areas. It's pretty heavy on the ink. Part of it because these are brand new ink pads. They are very juicy. They have a lot of ink to it. Partly because There's so much detail to this background. It was a little bit harder to get some areas being lighter and darker. I think the more I use these pads, the more comfortable I get with them, the more I'll be able to do that. I have a few other technique ideas that I want to use them for, and I'll use them in future videos. So I can't wait to see some of the different ways they can be used. This is the first time I'm using them for a project. And when the final result, the shimmer from them is absolutely gorgeous. But with the final result, because the ink was fairly heavy, I think I would have preferred some matte blending inks. I still wanted to share this because I absolutely love the shimmer and the shine that they have. And I do really like the background. I just would like to have some areas that were a little bit lighter and darker. Once I'm done with that mojito, I go in with the Love Struck, and I want the Love Struck, this pink color, to be on the inside part of the foxgloves. To be honest, I didn't Google what they look like. I was going by what I think my memory of foxgloves are. It may be completely inaccurate, but the great thing about creating is you can have creative liberties. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as the real thing. So rather than going and Googling to see if my memory might be right, I'm just going with what I want to do. I didn't want my flowers to be all one color and basically have embossed blobs, if you will, of purple. I wanted there to be a different color inside, but I didn't want it to be something super contrasting. So by doing the Love Struck, it coordinates beautifully with the purple, which is the ultraviolet, but it also gives a little bit of extra detail, a little bit of extra color in here. Once the Love Struck is done, I'm doing the same thing as I did before with the ultraviolet. Now I'm starting at the top of the flowers and kind of flicking my way down. You can tell that I didn't use my sticky mat for this because I wanted to be able to use or to move the paper around a little bit easier. And by not having a mat underneath, it just made it a little bit easier to do this ink blending. So I start by flicking the color from the top to the bottom, and then I also go from the bottom up, simply because I wanted the edges of the flowers to have a little bit more crisp coloring to them. And this is where, by using the metallic pads and having them one solid color, they're a little bit, in my opinion, you lose a little bit of the floral detail with them. And I think that would show a little bit better with some matte blending inks. Just my opinion. And I just wanted to share that with you while I was creating. Again, I love the shine from these. And I think maybe if I had if they were embossing folders that I had a stencil for, I might have a little bit more control that way. I was focusing mostly on not getting the color on the background to try to get it only on the raised edges. And these detailed ink blending brushes do a great job of that. But again, there's not a lot of variation in the purple color. It's fairly solid. So just know that when you're working with these, if you don't have a stencil with them, that may or that may not be an issue for you. And it's just nice to know those things going in. It's not a negative thing and not a don't do this. I just wanted to share my thoughts. Again, I can't wait to use them with some other techniques because the shimmer is absolutely gorgeous. The metallic shine to them is absolutely gorgeous. And I do break up the image by adding a sentiment to the bottom part, because the bottom part tends to be fairly solid purple because the clusters of those foxgloves are a little bit heavier on the bottom of the image, as they would be if you would see a picture of the flowers, right? So by breaking it up, I think it does improve it. It makes it so that it's not quite as heavy on the bottom of the card because you've got the sentiment on there breaking it up. Coloring these images are fairly quick. These ones, obviously, as you can tell, take a lot longer than the card before with the dahlias, because I already had the anthracite on that background and could just color it solidly with one color and still get the two different colors on there with those interference pads. Those ones were a little bit easier to color than these foxgloves, just because of the techniques that I was using. And it was also probably a little bit easier to color them because I didn't really have to worry as much about the detail and making sure to not get it on the background, because I could the flowers were fairly large and I can work from the outside in and not have to worry about making sure that I only had the ink on the raised surfaces. Detailed ink blending brushes also make it take a little bit longer simply because they hold a little bit less ink. However, they also are more accurate. So using a large ink blending brush would not really work here simply because you'd get too much ink on that background. Another option would be to do this background with ink on the background like the anthracite one that I did earlier, but then using some dye inks to blend those flowers together. You wouldn't have to worry about the background quite as much, and you can concentrate a little bit more on getting some visual dimension with some lights and dark areas. And by doing that, I think it would be a little bit easier to color simply because you can work on or concentrate on that rather than concentrating on only getting on the raised areas and not getting it on the background. Again, there's many different ways to color these images in. This is just my thoughts as I'm ink blending because it does take a little while to do this ink blending. And again, I love the final result and the gorgeous shine from the metallic, but because of these particular flowers, I think different inks would probably have been better. And you can see when I do the next card that I'm using the metallic inks as well. However, the coloring of those ones, because they're different flowers, are a little bit quicker than these ones were. These ones were a little bit more detailed, mainly because I put the pink on the inside, but I think that's necessary because, like I said before, if I didn't put that pink on the inside, it would be kind of large areas of just purple. So once I have that background done, I'm going to do the same trimming as my first cards. My image embossed piece here is going to be 3 3/4 by 5 inches. My outer mat is 4 inches by 5 1/4, and the mat in between that is going to be 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. I'm doing that with my white cardstock, the Hammermill cardstock, and then I'm going to use my pads to color out the outside of those mats just to make sure to frame them. I'm using the ultraviolet here for this mat. And this is the card that I wasn't sure if I wanted the upper layer of my sentiment to be the ultraviolet color or the Love Struck color. So I'm going to cut them with both, and then I can put them right on my sentiment and see which one I prefer. Pretty sure I'm going to prefer the Love Struck when I'm creating this, but I also wanted to have the option of seeing what the ultraviolet would look on there. Because again, just like I said before, because there's so much of that ultraviolet color, that's why I thought the Love Struck would be better because it would break it up a little bit more. And again, by putting that color in the middle of that cardstock, I'm just making that cardstock go a little bit farther. I have a ton of white cardstock scraps, so I can easily use one of them. This is just easy. I already have it here. I already have my pad out, and I can do that in the center there. So off screen, I did my die cutting for my sentiments. I'm going to use the Thanks sentiment. This is from the Best Wishes and Thanks Extra Large die set. I use this one often because I love the font of it. I love the size of it, and it works really, really well for these embossed backgrounds. Again, I'm using the Barely Art glue for gluing this down. I'll put my acrylic block on there to hold it in place. For the shadow for this one, I'm using some white cardstock, and you can see how I can lay that shadow on top of that acrylic block, put my other Thanks die cuts on there, and see right off the bat which one I prefer. So just like I said before, I was pretty sure I was going to like the Love Struck one. I did prefer that one, so that's the one I'm going for. The one that I have already die cut with the ultraviolet, I'll just save that for a future card. Now, one thing that I did a little bit different with this card is I put some stickles in the centers of those florals, again, just to get a little bit of sparkle, give it a little bit of extra texture. And then rather than doing the stickles on top of my Thanks sentiment, I went in and used some glossy accents on top of there. Now, the one thing with the glossy accents, you see the pink there, but what you don't see after it has dried is you can't tell that it's metallic. You can't tell it's metallic ink. So just know ahead of time, if you put some glossy accents on top of that, you're going to see the pink color, but you're not going to get metallic shine with that glossy accents. You just have that dimension and that shine. It doesn't look metallic anymore. It still coordinates with the colors in the card and with that pink, but you can't tell that there's metallic ink on there. And I thought that was really interesting. I was expecting to see the metallic shine underneath that glossy accents, but once it was dried, you can't really tell. So just something to be aware of, something that I found really, really interesting, and I wasn't expecting at all. Just like when I did the stickles on the Smile die cut, once I have the glossy accents on here, and even though I have a fine tip on my glossy accents bottle, I will go in with my die pick and I will clean any areas up. So for this one, I didn't really go over the edges. I just went and I cleaned up some areas where I didn't have that glossy accents all the way to the edge. The die pick has a really nice fine point to it. You absolutely have to do this the second you finish putting that glossy accent on there. You cannot let it dry in any way, shape, or form before doing this. Otherwise, you're going to ruin it. And you can also see that I'm going in, cleaning up an area, and then using my fingers on my left hand to clean off the tip of that die pick before going back in and cleaning up another area. So I will let it dry completely. And here is the finished result. Again, looks really great. The pink is nice and bright, but it doesn't look metallic underneath that glossy accents. Super interesting. For my last card, I'm using the August Dahlia embossing folder. And like I said before, for this one, I'm using some black cardstock. So I'm going to emboss it. I'm not inking my background at all. I'm just embossing that black cardstock. And then I'm going to use, again, metallic ink pads for this. For my flowers, I'm going to use the Love Struck, which is that pink again. I'm also going to use the pumpkin. I wanted to try get a bit of a different color for my flowers than just the pinks and purples I've been using, and wanted to bring in another color. For my greens, for this one, I'm going to use the verdigris. I just pointed out the verdigris and the mojito, the difference between them on my black cardstock there. The verdigris just has a bit of a darker, just a better green tone, I thought, for a black background rather than that mojito. The mojito is a little bit lighter. It almost has like a silvery green to it. So I just preferred that for my black background. Again, neither one is right or wrong. This is personal preference. And I just wanted an opportunity to bring in a different color. Just like the dahlias, just like the peonies, these dahlias are quite large for flowers. So these ones came together and were easily colored, or colored a lot quicker and a lot easier than the foxgloves. So just like the dahlias, I'm taking my detailed ink blending brushes, and because these have really fine petals to them, I still wanted to use the detailed brushes. I'm starting at the edge, the outer edge of the flowers, and kind of working my way in. I'm not super concerned about getting everything colored. I'm making sure that I have all the raised areas colored, not necessarily all of the bases of each petals. I want there to be some areas that are lighter and some areas that are darker. And I found with this black background, it was a little bit more forgiving with that. I could have some areas that didn't have color on them and it didn't look like it was missing color. And by starting at the outside and working my way in, when it came to the inner areas, I could kind of put the ink on my detail brush and cover all of those inner areas without worrying about getting any color on my background. Now, if you wanted, you could do all of the dahlias the same color here, but I do think using two different colors breaks it up a little bit and it just enhances it a little bit. So I'm using the pumpkin here for the orange color. You could go in with the ultraviolet, which is the one that I used on the last card. Again, I wanted to just bring in a different color and show you a different one of the metallic ink pads, but I still wanted that pink in there. I didn't want to do this, the pumpkin color, and I can't remember what the yellow one is. I think it might be Sunshine. Can't remember. So by doing that pink and the pumpkin, we still get the pink in this card. So I typically, when I'm doing a video, I like my cards to kind of coordinate all with each other, either having the same cardstock colors or similar ink colors, just so they all look good together when you see them all at the end. Just a personal preference. I just like it. Again, this doesn't happen all the time, but if possible, I will try to do that. But by bringing in a bit of a different color here, it still coordinates with the other cards. It just shows you a different color. So I've done that Love Struck one. I'm going in doing all of the ones that I want to be the pumpkin color, and then I will go back with that Love Struck and do the remainder. So I tried to make sure as much as possible that I didn't have two pink ones beside each other, that I didn't have two pumpkin ones beside each other, just to make sure that each flower was beside one of a different color to make them show up a little bit better. Any of the areas that I missed with that verdigris, I went back in and finish that up. And you can see right off the bat that these flowers are a lot easier and a lot quicker to color in than those foxgloves. This is taking a lot less time. The flowers are a lot larger, and because each of the flower is a solid color, it's going together a lot quicker. One way that I think these would look great is, say, doing the tip of the petals in one color and then the base of them in another color. Again, that's going to take a lot longer for doing that coloring. I think it would look absolutely great and stunning, but it would make it take a lot longer. But by using the black cardstock here and just kind of doing the outer edges of the petal, I get a little bit of that visual dimension by having the black cardstock on the inner edges of the petal. And using the black cardstock and metallic ink pads isn't going to work for every card. You can tell that this one, despite the different flowers, also has a completely different vibe than the foxgloves with the light, bright background. It's just a different idea, a different way to do it. And some florals I think will work better with this than others. So once I have that completely done, I do let my ink dry for a few moments, and then I'm going to trim them down. And once again, they're trimmed down to exactly the same size as all my other ones. My embossed piece here is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. The outer mat is going to be 4 inches by 5 1/4, and the mat in between that is going to be 3 7/8 by 5 1/8. And I did all the mats for this card in black cardstock. I'm going to ink them just like I did before. Actually, I think I'm going to ink just one of them, just like I did before, but I don't want to do it on white cardstock. You could see when I showed you the samples that the inks showed up different on white cardstock than they did on black. So I think if I did a mat with white cardstock here and use the ink on it, even though the ink is the same, because the cardstock underneath is a different color, it's going to show up different. It's going to look different, and it's not going to coordinate perfectly, which is the reason for doing this in the first place. So for my second mat, I only did that Love Struck around the outside edges. For this one, I'm using a Congrats sentiment. This one is from the Wedding Day Extra Large sentiment set. I'm doing my shadow in that pumpkin inked black cardstock, and then the upper sentiment is going to be just the black cardstock. And even though I have a ton of black cardstock scraps, I still did the upper part out of the center. I already have them out ready to go. Easy way to do it. So then I glued my mats and my embossed piece down, and you can see that because I'm using black cardstock here, it is really quite dark. You see that color when you tilt it more into the light, especially the color from the mats. You could also do your mat for this in white cardstock, because you do see the white edge from your card base. I chose to still do a white card base on this. If you wanted to brighten up that a little bit more, I chose to just do the pumpkin shadow and then the black upper piece. But again, if you want your sentiment to pop a little bit more, what you could do is use white cardstock for the shadow and then that pumpkin piece for the upper part of the sentiment. Just a few different options. Once I have the sentiment done, and for this one I did do my sentiment off the card. I put the upper layer onto the shadow so that I could easily move it around. Because the cardstock was so dark, it was a little bit hard sometimes to see, and by having that sentiment not put on the card yet, it made it a little bit easier to be able to see it, to be able to move it in place. So here is the final result. You can see when I tilt it into the light, you really get that shimmer from the metallic, and it definitely pops differently on that black cardstock than the foxgloves do on the white. There's definitely a different look and a different vibe to it. Second one here is those foxgloves with those metallic ink pads on the white cardstock. Just like I've said a couple times, definitely looks completely different and has a different feel to it than on the black cardstock. And then we have my favorite interference inks on these peonies here on the flowers, as well as that sentiment. I love that shimmer and shine you get from it. But funny enough, this one ended up being my favorite. Super simple, very easy to do. I'm not sure why. I just love the look of that anthracite and the white. And then finally, we have the very first one, which is the tulips. Love that wax paste on the upper edges. It has some gorgeous shimmer when you put it in the light. If you have a favorite, just put it in the comments below. I'm really interested to hear which ones or which techniques were your favorite. Again, there's no right or wrong. It's fun to play with them and use different inks, different pastes, different products on them just to see the different looks that you get. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.